Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Today we are going to discuss about relative clauses. We are from group relative clauses 1. So consists of 4 presenters. The first presenter is Hafiz Bagasiantama, and the second presenter is Muhammad Zudianto, and the third, as also as the moderator, is Nanda Bahtiar, and the fourth presenter is Vicky Haditya Faizi. Today discussions about relative clauses. 1. uh, Divided into 2 points. The first is relative clauses as a modifiers of nouns, and the second is integrated versus supplementary relatives. For relative clauses as modifier of nouns will be explained by Ian. Time is yours.
All right, thank you very much. So the first material is what is relative clause and what is the function? So basically, relative clauses is a special kind of subordinate clause, which is it cannot stand by itself, and its function is to modify a noun or nominal. But we can also say that the function of relative clause is to give more information about noun, pronoun, or situation in the main clause by using relative pronoun. What are relative pronoun? Relative pronouns, for example, who, which, when, where, and whose. And the examples, the secretary wrote to all the members who were absent from the meeting. Who were absent from the meeting here is the relative clause, and it modifies the head noun, all the members. And the second, the film which I needed is unobtainable. Which I needed here is the relative clause, and it modifies the head noun, the film. And then, as I mentioned before, the function of relative clause is to give more information about noun in the main clause by using relative pronoun. And then the head noun that the relative clause modifies is called the antecedent. So all the members and the film here are the antecedents. And the relation between a pronoun and its antecedent is called anaphora. So the pronoun who here is anaphorically related to the noun members, and the pronoun which is anaphorically related to the head noun, the film. And then we have the WH and non-WH relative clauses. Relative clauses essentially contains relative pronouns that express anaphoric relation to the modified head noun. However, relative pronouns do not have to be explicitly present. So, in the other words, relative pronouns do not obligatory to be present in the relative clause. Relative clause that contain an explicit relative pronoun are called the WH relative clauses, and the non-WH relative clauses do not contain an explicit relative pronouns. And here we divided the non-WH relative clauses into two parts. The first one is that relative clause, and the second one is bare relative clause. The examples, WH relative clauses, the film which I needed is not obtainable. Is the same as the previous example. And then the second one, the non-WH relative clauses, the example of that relative clauses. The film that I needed is not obtainable. And bare relative clauses, the film I needed is not obtainable. So as we can see here, there are no relative pronouns in the examples, but we still can see the anaphoric relation to the head nouns. And there are so blank spaces right after the relative clause, thus indicates the covered presence of the relativized elements. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Ian. So the next topic we are gonna explain about the relativized element that will be explained by the second speaker. Geoffrey, time is yours.
Okay, thank you, Jessica. And now we're moving to the relativized element. So, relativized element is an element inside the relative clauses that is anaphorically linked to the head noun. As mentioned before, anaphora is the relation between a pronoun and its antecedent. An antecedent is the expression in an upper clause that is modified by the relative clause, or we can also say that the antecedent is the head noun of the clause. Okay, and next slide. Okay, and now we have different functions of the relativized elements in WH relative clauses. Okay, so before we talk about the different functions of the relativized elements, uh, WH relative clauses is a relative clauses that has a relativized element that is explicitly present. As you can see here, there are who, which, when, where, and why. And here we have different functions of the relativized elements. We have 6 functions, and the first is subject, a guy who kicked the ball. Why it says that the function is as a subject? Because if we change the sentence to the uh, common declarative sentence, it could be a guy kicked the ball. So who here as the pronoun, it modifies the head noun, which the head noun is the subject of the clause. Okay, and then it also the same in the second functions is object. The head noun here as a object of the clause. So the pronoun which here it is modifying the head noun a ball. And the normal declarative sentence is he kicked the ball. A ball here as an object. And so it's also the same as the rest of the functions, as you can see in the complement of preposition. So we here the burger which she bought, why it says why it's saying the complement of preposition, because if we see the head now, the burger, uh, the the burger here as the complement of preposition. So pronoun which modifies the complement of the preposition in this clause. And so here there are pronouns which is who. We can use pronouns who for modifying the head noun that is a people, and then for which we can use this for things, and when for times, where for places, and why for reasons. Okay, and then next slide. Okay, here we have different functions of the relativized element, but in non-WH relative clauses. So as mentioned before, there are two types of relative clauses, that is WH relative clauses and non-WH relative clauses. So here we are explaining the non-WH relative clauses more specifically. And then, as you can see here in the example, there are an blank space in every sentence. From the first example, we can see a girl that fed blank space the dog. So blank space here is it indicates the position of the head noun in the normal declarative sentence. And then we can see also at the second examples here, if the a ball that he kicked, if he changed into the normal declarative sentence, it turns like he kicked the ball. So blank space here is indicating the position of the head noun, of the antecedent. And then in non-WH relative clauses, we have two types of relative clauses. There are that relative and bare relative, as mentioned before. And then one more in the example, except the first example, there are parentheses around that. It indicates that here is unobligatory, so you can omit the pronoun that here. So it could be a ball he kicked, that is okay, and we are using the bare relatives, that is using no pronoun. Okay, next slide. Our element with an embedded clause. Next slide. So it is possible for the R element to be located within a content clause embedded inside the relative clause. Okay, so before we explain the R element, let's see the definition of content clause. So content clause is a subordinate clause that provides content implied or commented upon by its main clause. So this subordinate clause, it contains the content, the meaning of the whole sentence, because there is another relative clauses that that provides more information that is actually unnecessary. If we omit the relative clauses, it didn't change the meaning. So the relative clauses here is necessary because if we omit the clause, it will it will change the meaning. Okay, next slide. Okay, okay, as we can see here, the example, a car which he says she bought. So which he says she bought is the relative clauses also as the content clauses. If we omit these clauses, it only a car, which means it didn't explain anything. So so it is possible if the R element, the pronoun here, if it's embedded in the content clause here, as we can see as in the bottom here, he says she bought R. So R here is indicating the the antecedent, the as we can see, as we can say, we can say that the R is also the head noun. And this two sentence is the sentence if we change it to the normal declarative sentence. Okay, next slide. The relative phrase. Okay, next slide. So there is more complex kind of relative construction that can be found only in the WH type, that is the relative phrase. Okay, so right now from the previous explanation, we can see that the the R element is only a pronoun, like um, a ball which he kicked. Yes, so the R element is only the pronoun. But here, the R element is not only the pronoun, but a phrase. So it contains more than one word. Okay, next slide. Okay, this is the example. He cannot find the guy whose book he's borrowing. See, here you can see the R element is not only whose as the pronoun, but also whose book is a phrase. So this phrase is as an R element that has anaphorically relation to the head noun. And oh, wait a minute. Can we? Yeah. And also here we can see the normal declarative sentence is borrowing ours book. So the R, the okay, see the head noun here, the antecedent is the guy here, not he at the beginning of the sentence, because whose book here is modifying the guy. So the antecedent here is also in the relative clause, in the subordinate clause of this sentence. Okay, I think that's all for the relativized element. Thank you. Next. Okay, Jessica.
All right, thank you, Geoffrey. So the next topic about integrated versus supplementary relatives. So here's we're gonna talk about the difference between integrated and supplementary relatives. There are three criteria that we can use to differentiate integrated with supplementary relatives. The first is intonation and punctuation that explain about the difference between integrated and supplementary relatives that makes them different in writing. And the second element is interpretation. It is talk more deeply about the meaning of both the relative clause, and the third is syntax. We are going to talk about the numbers of syntactic differences. So the first key to differentiate between integrated and supplementary is intonation and punctuation. Uh, in this intonation and punctuation, so for integrated relatives, it is integrated intentionally into the large construction. But for the supplementary, that it is set apart and spoken as a separate intonation unit. And also, the difference in the supplementary, the for the integrated is there is no punctuation, but in the supplementary there is punctuation, and the punctuation usually marked by commas. For example, we can see for the first sentences, the Indonesian netizen that unnecessary rude in social media are lack of manners. So we can see for the first examples, there are no punctuation, but for the supplementary, the Indonesian netizens, commas, that unnecessary rude in social media, comma, are lack of manner. The the and also for the second examples, we can see public school in Sulawesi, which make their non-Muslim student wearing hijab doesn't represent Bhinneka Tunggal Ika. And also for the supplementary, public school in Sulawesi, which make their non-Muslim student wearing hijab, commas, doesn't represent Bhinneka Tunggal Ika. So we can conclude from the examples by using the commas. There is a large difference that makes the intonations for integrated and supplementary difference. And for the second element to differentiate between integrated and supplementary relatives is interpretation. By using this interpretation, that we can know the relative clause which be defined to the head noun has the different meaning that we use for supplementary. The integrated presented as an integral part of the larger message, but for the supplementary presented as supplementary to that expressed in the rest of the sentences. It is additional or overend parenthetical material. Let's see the example. The first example is Anna's books that her father bought for birthday present are lost. For the supplementary, Anna's books, commas, that her father bought for birthday present are lost. So, we, as the illustrated from the examples, we can see that the relative clause serves to restrict the denotation of the sentence or of the head nouns differently. And for the next examples, the pancake that my mom made this morning was delicious. As I mentioned, the intonation and also the meaning is different. And for the supplementary examples is the pancake that my mom made this morning was delicious. So that my mom made this morning revert to the pancake. It divert the meaning into restrict definition, while the integrated that we can see the pancake that my mom made this morning was delicious is contain more like um, definition. Okay, we're gonna talk about the misleading about the two types of related clauses. So what I have mentioned before, that there are two types of relative clauses which are uh, integrated and supplementary clauses. So for both clauses, both relative clauses, traditionally called restrictive for integrated or sometimes defining, and for the supplementary relatives called non-restrictive, or it can be called non-defining. But it is traditionally called. So the problem is we don't use that term because it can be misleading interpretation. What I mean by misleading is the integrated relative is not always restrictive. So if you're wondering what is restrictive, restrictive means one that limits the meaning of something that comes before the sentence or the words. Let's take an example. The mother who had gave everything. So here we can see that the relative clause doesn't distinguish one mother from another. The mother here from the example is general and contain more large meaning. It's not restrictive as it means, right? So in the sentence, the mother refers to the only mother he has ever had. So there is only one mother here we are talking about. And then so the information, the relative clause is not semantically restrictive. It is indeed integrated. And then for the second example, we can see the A sentence. Mawar eat two cakes that her mother bought and two that her father bought. So we can see that in the B, Mawar eat two cakes that are delicious. So for A, you can see there are two cakes that her mother bought and two that her father bought. The relative clauses certainly are semantically restrictive because it explains about two cakes that her mother bought and two that her father bought. So they are restrictive. While while in the B examples, Mawar eat two cakes that are delicious. But here we cannot know, or this has contained two meaning, which two cakes that are delicious. I mean there are no certain that Mawar eat another cake. so it's not restrictive. This is more likely the integrated, like for the example, the mother who had get everything. So if you see here, use we cannot generalize the two relative clauses that call restrictive because it's not always restrictive. Therefore, it's misleading. All right, that was explanation about the differences, um, supplementary and integrated. The third, the third key element that we use for differentiate integrated and supplementary relatives is syntax that will be explained by Adit. Time is yours.
Okay, thank you, Jessica. Now I want to explain about syntax. Next, next, test.
Yes, I can hear.
Wait, wait. Okay. Uh, Now I wanna explain about syntax. Next slide. Okay. The first, what is the syntax? Syntax is a set of grammar rules on words or clauses in forming sentences, and this four of syntactic differences. The first is WH relatives versus no WH relatives. Number two is antecedents allowed for supplementary relatives, and the third is which as pronoun or the determiner, and the last is function. Next. Next slide. Okay. The first differences is WH relatives versus no WH relatives. Supplementary relatives are almost always of the WH type, and but the bare construction is not allowed at all as a supplementary relatives, and supplementary the relatives are extremely rare and really only marginally present in standard English. Next. The second difference is antecedents allowed for supplementary relatives. Supplementary relatives allow a wider range of antecedents than integrated ones. They accept clauses and proper nouns without determiners. Next. For example, the first example is Max arrived late, which caused some delay. And the second is Max, who was usually very punctual, was 20 minutes late. In the first example, the antecedent of which is the preceding clause, because the sentence w the eh, sorry because the sentence blank 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 caused some delay, the blank blank is interpreted as Max arriving late. And in the second example, the antecedent of who is Max. We understand that Max was usually very punctual. Uh, Proper noun normally occur with integrated relatives only if there is a determiner, as he is not the Max I was referring to. Next. And the third difference is which as pronoun or determiner. In integrated relatives, only as a pronoun. In supplementary relatives, it can also be a determinative. Next. For example, this will keep us busy until Friday, by which time the boss will be back. The relative side element here is which time, not which alone, because it is the element that derives interpretation from the antecedent Friday. Next. The last is the function. Integrated relatives function as dependent, but supplementary relatives are attached more loosely. That's all. Okay, that's all for me.